Section 27 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jonathan Drury. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 1, Part 2c. After suppressing some attempts at mutiny amongst the soldiers, in which those who had come with Narvaez were the most to blame, Cortes again marched forwards, and, with the help of the Tlascalans, first attacked the people of Tepeaca and of other neighboring provinces, a measure which had the advantage of exercising anew his own troops in war, and of training his allies. While this was going on, two brigantines bringing ammunition and reinforcements fell into the hands of Cortes. These ships had been sent to Narvaez by Velasquez, in ignorance of his misadventures. At this time also some Spaniards sent by Francis de Garay, governor of Jamaica, joined the army. In consequence of these reinforcements, the troops with Cortes, after he had rid himself of several partisans of Narvaez with whom he was dissatisfied, amounted to 500 infantry, of whom 80 carried muskets, and 40 horse soldiers. With this army, and with 1,000 Tlascalans, Cortes set out once more for Mexico on the 28th of December, 1520, 6 months after he had been forced to abandon the city. This campaign had for its theatre countries already described, and must therefore be passed over somewhat rapidly here, notwithstanding the interest attaching to it. To enter fully into the history of the conquest of Mexico would not be in accordance with the primary object of this work. After the death of Montezuma, his brother Cuitlavaca was raised to the throne, and he adopted all the measures of precaution compatible with Aztec strategic science. But he died of the smallpox, the sad gift of the Spaniards to the New World, at the very moment when his brilliant qualities of foresight and bravery were the most needed by his country. His successor was Guatimozin, the nephew of Montezuma, a man distinguished by his talents and courage. Cortes had no sooner entered the Mexican territory than fighting began. He speedily captured the town of Tezcuco, which was situated at 20 miles' distance, upon the edge of the great central lake, that lake upon whose waters the Spaniards were to see an imposing flotilla floating 3 months later. At this time a fresh conspiracy, which had for its object the assassination of Cortes and his principal officers, was discovered, and the chief culprit executed. At this moment fate seemed in every way to smile upon Cortes. He had just received the news of the arrival of fresh reinforcements at Vera Cruz, and the greater part of the towns under the dominion of Guatimozin had submitted to the force of his arms. The actual siege of Mexico began in the month of May, 1521, and continued with alternate success and reverse until the day when the brigantines were launched upon the water of the lake. The Mexicans did not hesitate to attack them. From 4,000 to 5,000 canoes, each bearing 2 men, covered the lake and advanced to the assault of the Spanish vessels, which carried in all nearly 300 men. These 9 brigantines were provided with cannon, and soon dispersed or sunk the enemy's fleet, who thenceforth left them in undisputed possession of the water. But this success and certain other advantages gained by Cortes had no very marked consequences, and the siege dragged slowly on until the general made up his mind to capture the town by force. Unfortunately, the officer who was charged with protecting the line of retreat by the causeways while the Spaniards were making their way into the town, abandoned his post, thinking it unworthy of his valor, and went to join in the combat. Guatimozin was informed of the fault which had been committed, and at once took advantage of it. His troops attacked the Spaniards on all sides with such fury that numbers of them were killed in a short time, while 62 of the soldiers fell alive into the hands of the Mexicans, a fate which Cortes, who was severely wounded in the thigh, narrowly escaped sharing. During the night following, the great temple of the war god was illuminated in sign of triumph, and the Spaniards listened in profound sadness to the beating of the great drum. From the position they occupied they could witness the end of the prisoners, their unfortunate countrymen, whose breasts were open and their hearts torn out, and whose dead bodies were hurled down the steps. They were then torn in pieces by the Aztecs, who quarreled over the pieces with the object of using them for a horrible festival. This terrible defeat caused the siege to go on slowly, until the day came when 3 parts of the city having been taken or destroyed, Guatimozin was obliged by his councillors to quit Mexico and to set out for the mainland, where he reckoned upon organizing his resistance, but the boat which carried him being seized, he was made prisoner. In his captivity he was destined to display much greater dignity and strength of character than his uncle Montezuma had done. From this time all resistance ceased, and Cortes might take possession of the half-destroyed capital. After a heroic resistance, in which 120,000 Mexicans, according to some accounts, but 240,000 according to others, had perished, after a siege which had lasted not less than 70 days, Mexico, and with the city all the rest of the empire, succumbed, less indeed to the blows dealt against it by the Spaniards than to the long-standing hatred and the revolts of the subjugated people, and to the jealousy of the neighboring states. Fated soon to regret the yoke which they had so deliberately shaken off. Contempt and rage soon succeeded amongst the Spaniards to the intoxication of success. The immense riches upon which they had reckoned either had no existence or they had been thrown into the lake. Cortès found it impossible to calm the malcontents, and was obliged to allow the emperor and his principal minister to be put to torture. Some historians, and notably Gomara, report that whilst the Spaniards were stirring the fire which burnt below the gridiron upon which the two victims were extended, the minister turned his head towards his master and apparently begged him to speak, in order to put an end to their tortures. But that Guatimozin reproved this single moment of weakness by these words: "And am I assisting at some pleasure, or am I in the bath?" An answer which has been poetically changed into, "And do I lie upon roses?" The historians of the conquest of Mexico have usually stopped short at the taking of Mexico, but it remains for us to speak of some other expeditions undertaken by Cortès with different aims, but which resulted in casting quite a new light upon some portions of Central America. Besides, we cannot leave this hero, who played so large a part in the history of the New World and in the development of its civilization, without giving some details of the end of his life. With the fall of the capital was involved, properly speaking, that of the Mexican Empire. If there was still some resistance, as notably there was in the province of Oaxaca, it was of an isolated character, and a few detachments of troops sufficed to reduce the submission to the last remaining opponents of the Spaniards, terrified as the Mexicans were by the punishments which had been dealt out to the people of Panuco, who had revolted. At the same time ambassadors were sent by the people of distant countries of the empire, to convince themselves of the reality of that wonderful event, the taking of Mexico, to behold the ruins of the abhorred town, and to tender their submission to the conquerors. Cortès was at length confirmed in the position he held after incidents which would take too long to relate, and which caused him to say, "It has been harder for me to fight against my countrymen than against the Aztecs." It now remained to him to organize the conquered country, and he began by establishing the seat of government in Mexico, which he rebuilt. He attracted Spaniards to the city by granting them concessions of land, and the Indians by allowing them at first to remain under the authority of their native chiefs, although he speedily reduced them all, except the Tlascalans, to the condition of slaves, by the vicious system of repartimientos, in vogue in the Spanish colonies. But if it is justifiable to reproach Cortès with having held cheaply to the political rights of the Indians, it must be conceded that he manifested the most laudable solicitude for their spiritual well-being. To further this object he brought over some Franciscans, who by their zeal and charity in a short time gained the veneration of the natives, and in a space of 20 years brought about the conversion of the whole population. At the same time Cortès sent some troops into the state of Michoacán, who penetrated as far as the Pacific Ocean, and as they returned visited some of the rich provinces situated in the north. Cortès found settlements in all the parts of the country which appeared to him advantageous, at Zacatula upon the shores of the Pacific, at Coliman in Michoacán, at Santa Sebastián near Tampico, at Medellín near Veracruz, etc. Immediately after the pacification of the country, Cortès entrusted Cristobal de Olid with the command of a considerable force, in order to establish a colony in Honduras, and at the same time Olid was to explore the southern coast of that province, and to seek for a strait which should form a communication between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But, carried away by the pride of command, Olid had no sooner reached his destination than he declared himself independent, whereupon Cortès immediately dispatched one of his relations to arrest the culprit, and set out himself, accompanied by Guatimozin, at the head of 100 horsemen and 50 foot soldiers, on the 12th of October, 1524. After crossing the provinces of Coatzacoalco, Tabasco, and Yucatan, and enduring all kinds of privations in the course of a most trying march over marshy and shifting ground, and across a perfect ocean of undulating forests, the detachment was approaching the province of Aculan, when Cortès was told of the existence of a plot, formed, as was said, by Guatimozin and the principal Indian chiefs. Its aim was to seize the first opportunity to massacre both officers and soldiers, after which the march to Honduras was to be continued, the settlements were to be destroyed, and then there was to be a return to Mexico, where during a general rising there would doubtless be small difficulty experienced in getting rid of the invaders. Guatimozin in vain protested his innocence, in which there is every reason to believe. He was hung, as well as several of the Aztec nobles, upon the branches of a ceiba tree which shaded the road. Bernal Diaz del Castillo says, "The execution of Guatimozin was very unjust, and we were all agreed in condemning it." But Prescott says, if Cortès had consulted his own interest and his renown, he should have spared him, for he was the living trophy of his victory, as a man keeps gold in the lining of his coat. At length the Spaniards reached Aculan, a flourishing town, where they refreshed themselves after their journey in excellent quarters, when they set out again. It was in the direction of the Lake of Petén, a part of the country where the population was easily converted to Christianity. We shall not dwell upon the sufferings and misery which tried the expedition in these sparsely peopled countries, until it arrived at San Gil de Buenavista, upon the Golfo Dulce, where Cortez, after receiving the news of the execution of Olid and the re-establishment of the central authority, embarked upon his return to Mexico. At this time he entrusted to Alvarado the command of 300 infantry, 160 cavalry, and 4 cannon, with a body of Indian auxiliaries, with which he set out for the south of Mexico to conquer Guatemala. He reduced to submission the provinces of Zacatulan, Tehuantepec, Soconusco, Utlatlan, and laid the foundations of the town of Guatemala la Vieja. When, some time afterward, he made a voyage to Spain, he was named by Charles V governor of the countries which he had conquered. 3 years had not expired after the conquest, before a territory 1,200 miles in length upon the seaboard of the Atlantic, and 1,500 miles upon that of the Pacific, had submitted to the Castilian crown, and with but few exceptions, was in a state of perfect tranquillity. The return of Cortez to Mexico from the useless expedition to Honduras, which had wasted so much time and caused almost as great sufferings to the Spaniards as the conquest of Mexico, had taken place but a few days, when he received the news that he was temporarily replaced by another commander, and was invited to repair to Spain to exculpate himself from certain charges. He was not in any haste to comply with this order, hoping that it might be revoked, but his indefatigable calumniators and his implacable enemies, both in Spain and Mexico, preferred accusations against him after such a manner, that he found himself obliged to go and make his defense, to state his wrongs, and boldly to claim the approval of his conduct. Cortez therefore started, accompanied by his friend Sandoval, as well as by Tapia and under several Aztec chiefs, amongst whom was a son of Montezuma. He disembarked at Palos in May 1528, at the same place where Columbus had landed 35 years before, and he was welcomed with the same enthusiasm and rejoicings as the discoverer of America had been. Here Cortez met with Pizarro, then at the outset of his career, who was come to solicit the support of the Spanish government. Cortez afterwards set out for Toledo, where the court then was. The mere announcement of his return had produced a complete change in public opinion. His unexpected arrival at once contradicted the idea that he harbored any projects of revolt and independence. Charles V saw that public feeling would be outraged at the thought of punishing a man who had added its greatest gem to the crown of Castile, and so the journey of Cortez became one continual triumph in the midst of crowds of people greater than had ever been known before. The houses and streets of the large towns and of the villages, says Prescott, were filled with spectators impatient to contemplate the hero whose single arm might be said, in some sort, to have conquered an entire empire for Spain, and who, to borrow the language of an old historian, marched in all the pomp and glory, not of a great vassal, but of an independent monarch. Charles V, after having granted several audiences to Cortez, and bestowed upon him those particular marks of favour which are termed important by courtiers, deigned to accept from him the empire which he had conquered for him, and the magnificent presents which he brought. But he considered that he had fully recompensed him when he had given Cortez the title of Marquis de Valle de Oaxaca, and the post of Captain General of New Spain, without however restoring him to the civil government, a power which had been formerly delegated to him by the Junta of Vera Cruz. Cortez, after his marriage with a niece of the Duke de Béjar, who belonged to one of the first families in Spain, accompanied the emperor, who was on his way to Italy, to the port of embarkation. But the general, soon becoming tired of the frivolities of the court, so little in accordance with the active habits of his past life, set out again for Mexico in 1530, and landed at Villarica. After his arrival he underwent some annoyance caused by the Audiencia, which had exercised the power in his absence, and which had instituted lawsuits against him, and he also found himself in conflict with the new civil junta on the subject of military affairs. The Marquis de la Valle withdrew himself to Cuernavaca, where he had immense estates, and busied himself with agriculture. He was the means of introducing the sugar cane and the mulberry to Mexico. He also encouraged the cultivation of hemp and flax, and the breeding, on a large scale, of merino sheep. But this peaceable life without adventures could not long satisfy the enterprising spirit of Cortez. In 1532 and 1533 he equipped 2 squadrons destined to make voyages of discovery in the northwest of the Pacific. The latter expedition reached the southern extremity of the peninsula of California without attaining the object sought, namely the discovery of a strait uniting Pacific with the Atlantic. Cortez himself met with no better success in 1536 in the Vermilion Sea, Gulf of California. 3 years later a concluding expedition, of which Cortez gave the command to Ulloa, penetrated to the farthest extremity of the Gulf, and then, sailing along the exterior side of the peninsula, reached the 29th degree of north latitude. From thence the chief of the expedition sent back one of his ships to Cortez, while the rest proceeded northwards, but from that time nothing more is heard of them,
Such was the unhappy result of the expedition of Cortez, which, while they did not bring him a single ducat, cost him not less than 300,000 gold castellanos. But they at least had the result of making known the coast of the Pacific Ocean, from the Bay of Panama as far as Colorado. The tour of the California peninsula was made, and it was thus discovered that what had been imagined to be an island was in reality a part of the continent. The whole of the Vermilion Sea, or Sea of Cortez as the Spaniards justly named it, was carefully explored, and it was ascertained that, instead of having an outlet as was supposed to the north, it was in reality only a gulf deeply hollowed into the continent. Cortez had not been able to fit out these expeditions without coming into antagonism with the viceroy Don Antonio de Mendoza, whom the emperor had sent to Mexico, an appointment which had wounded the feelings of the Marquis de Lavalle. Wearied with these continual annoyances, and indignant at finding his prerogative as captain general, if not absolutely ignored, at least perpetually questioned, Cortez left Mexico, and once more set out for Spain. But this journey was not destined at all to resemble the first. Grown old, disgusted with life, and betrayed by fortune, the conquistador had no longer anything to expect from government. He had not to wait long before receiving proof of this. One day he pressed through the crowd which surrounded the emperor's coach, and mounted upon the step of the door. Charles V pretended not to recognize him, and asked who this man was. Cortez answered proudly, "It is the man who has given you more states than your father left you towns." By this time public interest was diverted from Mexico, which had not yielded as much as had been expected from it, and was centered upon the marvelous riches of Peru. Cortez was, however, received with honor by the Supreme Council of the Indies, and permitted to state his complaints before it, but the debates upon the subject were endlessly drawn out, and he could obtain no redress. In 1541, against the disastrous expedition of Charles V against Algiers, Cortez, who was serving in it as a volunteer, but whose counsels had not been listened to, had the misfortune to lose 3 great carved emeralds, jewels which would have sufficed for the ransom of an empire. Upon his return he renewed his solicitations, but with the same want of success. His grief over this injustice and these repeated disappointments was so deep that his health suffered severely. He died far from the scene of his exploits, on the 10th of November, 1547, at Castilleja de la Cuesta, at the very moment when he was making preparations to return to America. He was a true knight-errant, says Prescott. Of all that glorious troop of adventurers which the Spain of the 16th century sent forth to a career of discovery and conquest, there was not one more deeply imbued with the spirit of romantic enterprise than Fernando Cortez. Strife was his delight, and he loved to attempt an enterprise by its most difficult side. This passion for the romantic might have reduced the conqueror of Mexico to the part of a common adventurer, but Cortez was certainly a profound politician and a great captain, if one is justified in giving this name to a man who accomplished great actions by his own unassisted genius. There is no other example in history of so great an enterprise having been carried to a successful end with such inadequate means. It may be said with truth that Cortez conquered Mexico with his own resources alone. His influence over the minds of his soldiers was the natural result of their confidence in his ability, but it must be attributed also to his popular manners, which rendered him eminently fit to lead a band of adventurers. When he had attained to a higher rank, if Cortez displayed more of pomp, his veterans at least continued on the same terms of intimacy with him as before. In finishing this portrait of the conquistador, we shall quote the upright and veracious Bernal Diaz, with whose sentiments we fully agree. He preferred his name of Cortez to all the titles by which he might be addressed. And he had good reasons for it, for the name of Cortez is as famous in our days as that of Caesar among the Romans, or Hannibal amongst the Carthaginians. The old chronicler ends by a touch which vividly depicts the religious spirit of the 16th century. Perhaps he was destined to receive his reward only in a better world, and I fully believe it to be so, for he was an honest knight, very sincere in his devotions to the Virgin, to the Apostle St. Peter, and to all the saints.
End of second part, Chapter 1, Part 2C. Recording by Jonathan Drury, Los Angeles, California.
Section 28 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by HearHis.com. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1, Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second Part, Chapter 1, Part 3, The Conquerors of Central America. The information which had been gained by Balboa as to the riches of the countries situated to the south of Panama had scarcely become known to the Spaniards before several expeditions were organized to attempt the conquest of them. But all had failed, either from the means used being insufficient, or from the commanders not being equal to the greatness of the undertaking. It must be confessed also that the localities explored by these first adventurers, these pioneers, as they would be called nowadays, did not at all come up to what Spanish greed had expected from them, and for this reason, that all the attempts had been hitherto made upon what was then called terra firma, a country preeminently unhealthy, mountainous, marshy, and covered with forests. The inhabitants were few, but of so warlike a disposition that they had added another obstacle to all those which nature had strewn with so prodigal a hand in the path of the invaders. Little by little, therefore, the enthusiasm had cooled, and the wonderful narratives of Balboa were mentioned only to be turned into ridicule. There lived, however, in Panama a man well able to weigh the truth of the reports which had been circulated concerning the richness of the countries bathed by the Pacific. This man was Francisco Pizarro, who had accompanied Muñez de Balboa to the southern sea, and who now associated with himself two other adventurers, Diego de Almagro and Ferdinand de Luque. A few words must be said about the chiefs of the enterprise. Francisco Pizarro, born near Truxillo between the years 1471 and 1478, was the natural son of a certain Captain Gonzalo Pizarro, who had taught the boy nothing but to take care of pigs. He was soon tired of this occupation, and took advantage of his having allowed one of the animals who were in his charge to stray, not to return to the paternal roof, where he was accustomed to be cruelly beaten for the smallest peccadillo. The young Pizarro enlisted, and after passing some years amidst the Italian wars, he followed Christopher Columbus to Hispaniola in 1510. He served there with distinction, and also in Cuba. Afterwards he accompanied Ojeda de Darien, discovered, as has already mentioned, the Pacific with Balboa, and after the execution of the latter he assisted Pedrarias Davila, whose favorite he had become in the conquest of all the country known as Castile de Or. While Pizarro was an illegitimate child, Diego de Almagro was a fondling, picked up, according to some, in 1475 at Adila de Rey, but according to others at Almargo, from which circumstance, as they maintain, he derived his name. He was educated in the midst of soldiers, and while still young went to America, where he had succeeded in amassing a small fortune. Ferdinand de Luque was a rich ecclesiastic of Tobago, who exercised the calling of a schoolmaster at Panama. The youngest of these adventurers was by this time more than 50 years of age, and Garcilaso de la Vega relates that upon their project being known, they became the objects of general derision. Ferdinand de Luque was the most laughed at, and was called by no other name than Hernando el Loco, Ferdinand the Fool. The terms of partnership were soon agreed upon between these three men, of whom two at least were without fear, if they were not all three without reproach. Luque furnished money needed for the armament of the vessels and the pay of the soldiers, and Almagro bore an equal part in the expense, but Pizarro, who possessed nothing but his sword, was to pay his contribution in another manner. It was he who took the command of the first attempt, upon which we shall dwell in some detail, because it was then that the perseverance and inflexible obstinacy of the conquistador first came fully into sight. One of the historians of the conquest of Peru, Agustin de Zarate, relates as follows: "Having then asked and obtained the permission of Pedro Arias de Avila, Francisco Pizarro, after much trouble, equipped a vessel upon which he embarked with 140 men, At the distance of 150 miles from Panama, he discovered a small and poor province named Peru, which caused the same name to be henceforward improperly bestowed upon all that country which was discovered along that coast for the space of more than 3,600 miles in length. Passing onwards, he discovered another country, which the Spaniards called the Burnt People. The Indians slew so many of his men that he was constrained to retire in great disorder to the country of Chimchama, which is not far distant from the place whence he had started. Almagro, however, who had remained at Panama, fitted out a ship there, upon which he embarked with 70 Spaniards, and descended the coast as far as the river San Juan, 300 miles from Panama. Not having met with Pizarro, he went back northwards as far as the Burnt People, where, having ascertained by certain indications that Pizarro had been there, he landed his men. But the Indians, puffed up by the victory which they had gained over Pizarro, resisted bravely, forced the entrenchments with which Almagro had covered his position, and obliged him to re-embark. He returned, therefore, still following the coast line until he arrived at Chinchama, where he found Francisco Pizarro. They were much rejoiced at meeting again, and having added to their followers some fresh soldiers whom they had levied, they found their troops amounted to 200 Spaniards, and once more they descended the coast. They suffered so much from scarcity of provisions and from the attacks of the Indians that Don Diego returned to Panama to collect more recruits and to obtain provisions. He took back with him 80 men, with whom and with those who remained to them they went as far as the country called Catamez, a country moderately peopled, and where they found abundance of provisions. They noticed that the Indians of these parts who attacked them and made war against them had their faces studded with nails of gold inserted in holes, which they had made expressly for receiving these ornaments. Diego de Almagro returned once again to Panama, whilst his companion waited for him, and for the reinforcements which he was to bring with him, in a small island called Cock Island, where he suffered much from the scarcity of all the necessaries of life. Upon his arrival in Panama, Almagro could not obtain permission from Los Rios, the successor of Avila, to make new levies, for he had no right, Los Rios said, to allow a greater number of people to go and perish uselessly in the rash enterprise. He even sent a boat to Cock Island to bring away Pizarro and his companions. But such a decision could not be pleasing to Almagro and de Luque. It meant expense thrown away, and it meant the annihilation of the hopes which the sight of the ornaments of gold and silver of the inhabitants of Catamez had caused them to entertain. They sent therefore a trusty person to Pizarro to recommend him to persevere in his resolution, and to refuse to obey the orders of the governor of Panama. But Pizarro in vain held out the most seductive promises. The remembrance of the fatigues which had been endured was too recent, and all his companions, except 12, abandoned him. With these intrepid men, whose names have been preserved, and amongst whom was Garcia de Xerez, one of the historians of the expedition, Pizarro retired to an uninhabited island, at a greater distance from the coast, to which he gave the name Gorgona. There the Spaniards lived miserably on mangles, fish, and shellfish, and awaited for 5 months the succor that Almagro and de Luque were to send to them. At length, vanquished by the unanimous protestations of the whole colony, who were indignant that people whose only crime was that they had not despaired of success should be left to perish miserably, and as though they were malefactors, Los Rios sent to Pizarro a small vessel to bring him back, with the object of presenting no temptation to Pizarro to make use of this ship to renew his expedition. Not a single soldier was placed on board of her. At the sight of the help which had arrived, and oblivious to all their privations, The 13 adventurers thought of nothing but persuading the sailors who came to seek them to participate in their own hopes, whereupon, instead of starting again on the route to Panama, they sailed all together towards the southeast, in spite of contrary winds and currents, until, after having discovered the island of St. Clara, they arrived at the port of Tumbez, situated beyond the 3rd degree of south latitude, where they saw a magnificent temple and a palace belonging to the Incas, the sovereigns of the country. The country was populous and fairly well cultivated, but what proved beyond all else seductive to the Spaniards, and made them think that they had reached the marvelous countries of which so much had been said, was the sight of so great an abundance of gold and silver, that these metals were employed not only as finery and ornament by the inhabitants, but also for making vases and common utensils. Pizarro caused the interior of the country to be explored by Pietro de Canida and Alonso de Molina, who brought back an enthusiastic description of it, and he caused some gold vases to be given to him, as well as some llamas, a quadruped domesticated by the Peruvians. He took 2 natives on board his vessel, to whom he proposed to teach the Spanish language, and to use them as interpreters when they should return to the country. He anchored successfully at Paita, Sagarata, and in the Bay of Santa Cruz, of which the sovereign, Capellana, received the strangers with such friendly demonstrations that several of them were unwilling to re-embark. After having sailed down the coast as far as Porto Santo, Pizarro set out on his return to Panama, where he arrived after 3 whole years spent in dangerous explorations, which had completely ruined De Luque and Almagro. Pizarro resolved to apply to Charles V, before undertaking the conquest of the country which he had discovered, for he could not obtain leave from Los Rios to engage fresh adventures. So he borrowed the sum required for the voyage, and in 1528 he went to Spain to inform the emperor of the work which he had undertaken. He painted the picture of the countries that were to be conquered in the most pleasing light, and as a reward for his labors, the titles of governor, captain general, and alguazil major of Peru were bestowed upon him and his heirs in perpetuity. At the same time he was ennobled, and a pension of 1,000 crowns was bestowed upon him. His jurisdiction, independent of the governor of Panama, was to extend over a tract of 600 miles along the coast of the south of the Santiago River. It was to be called New Castile, and he was to be the governor, concessions that cost nothing to Spain, for Pizarro had yet to conquer the country. On his side he undertook to raise a body of 250 men, and to provide himself with the necessary ships, arms, and ammunition. Pizarro then repaired to Truxillo, where he persuaded his 3 brothers, Ferdinand, Juan, and Gonzalo, to accompany him, as well as one of his half-brothers, Martin de Alcantara. He took advantage of his stay in his native town, and at Caraceras, to try and raise recruits, both there and throughout Estremadura. They did not, however, come forward in large numbers, in spite of the title Caballeros de la Espada Dorada, which he promised to bestow upon all who would serve under him. Then he returned to Panama, where affairs were not going so smoothly as he had hoped. He had succeeded in getting De Luque named Bishop Protector de los Indios, but for Almagro, whose talents he knew, and whose ambition he feared, he had only asked that he should be ennobled and a gratuity of 500 ducats bestowed upon him, with the government of a fortress which was to be built at Tumbez. Almagro refused to take part in this new expedition. He was not pleased with the meagre portion given to him after spending all his money on earlier expeditions. He wished now to organize one of his own account. It required all Pizarro's address, aided by the promise to give up to Almagro the office of adelantado, to appease him and make him consent to renew the old partnership. The resources of the three partners were so limited at this time that they could only get together 3 small ships and 124 soldiers, of whom 36 were horse soldiers. The expedition set out in February 1531 under the command of Pizarro and his 4 brothers, while Almagro remained at Panama to organize an expedition of supplies. At the end of 13 days' sailing, and after having been carried by a storm 300 miles more to the south than he had intended, Pizarro was forced to disembark both men and horses on the shores of the Bay of San Mateo, and to follow the line of the coast on land. This march was a difficult one in a very mountainous country, thinly peopled and intersected by rivers which had to be crossed at their mouths. At last a place called Coauqui was reached, where was found a great booty, which decided Pizarro to send back 2 of his ships. They carried to Panama and Nicaragua spoils to the amount of 30,000 castellanos, as well as a great number of emeralds, a rich booty which would, according to Pizarro, determine many adventurers to come and join him. Then the conqueror continued his march southwards as far as Puerto Viejo, where he was joined by Sebastian Benalcazar and Juan Fernandez, who brought him 12 horsemen and 30 foot soldiers. The effect which had been produced in Mexico by the sight of the horses and the reports of the firearms was repeated in Peru, and Pizarro was able to reach the island of Puna in the Gulf of Guayaquil without encountering any resistance. But the islanders were more numerous and more warlike than their brothers of the mainland, and for 6 months they valiantly resisted all the attacks of the Spaniards. Although Pizarro had received some aid from Nicaragua, brought by Ferdinand de Soto, and although he had beheaded the Cacique Tonaya and 16 of the principal chiefs, he could not overcome their resistance. He was therefore obliged to regain the continent, where the maladies peculiar to the country tried his companion so cruelly that he was forced to stay 3 months at Tumbez, exposed to the perpetual attacks of the natives. From Tumbez he went next to Rio Purilla, discovered the harbor of Paita, the best on this coast, and founded the colony of San Miguel at the mouth of the Chilo, in order that vessels coming from Panama might find safe shelter. It was here that Pizarro received some envoys from Huascar, and informed him of the revolt of Atahualpa, the brother of Huascar, and asked his aid. At the period when the Spaniards landed to conquer Peru, it extended along the shore of the Pacific Ocean for 1,500 miles, and stretched into the interior as far as the imposing chain of the Andes. Originally, the population was divided into savage and barbarous tribes, having no idea of civilization, and living in a perpetual state of warfare with one another. For many centuries affairs had continued in the same state, and there appeared no presage of the coming of a better era, when, on the shores of Lake Titicaca, there appeared to the Indians a man and woman who pretended that they were the children of the sun. They called themselves Manco Capac and Mama Oyeyo, and were of majestic appearance. According to Garcilaso de la Vega, towards the middle of the 12th century they united together a number of wandering tribes, and laid the foundations of the town of Cusco. Manco Capac had taught the men agriculture and mechanical arts, whilst Mama Oyeyo instructed the women in spinning and weaving. When Manco Capac had satisfied these first needs of all societies, he framed laws for his subjects, and constituted a regular political state. It was thus that the dominion of the Incas, or lords of Peru, was established. At first their empire was limited to the neighborhood of Cusco, but under their successors it rapidly increased, and extended from the Tropic of Capricorn to the Pearl Islands, a length of 30 degrees. The power of the Incas was as absolute as that of the ancient Asiatic sovereigns. Also, says Zarate, there was perhaps no other country in the world where the obedience and submission of the subjects was carried further. The Incas were to them quasi-divinitives. They had but to place a thread drawn from the royal head fillet in the hands of anyone, and the man so distinguished was certain to be everywhere respected and obeyed, and to find such absolute deference paid to the king's order which he carried, that he could alone exterminate a whole province without any assistance from soldiers, and cause to be put to death all the inhabitants, both male and female, because at the mere sight of this thread, taken from the royal crown, the people voluntarily and without any assistance offered themselves up to die. However, the old chronicles all agreed in saying that this unlimited power was always used for the Incas for the well-being of their subjects. Out of the series of 12 kings who in succession sat on the throne of Peru, there was not one who did not leave behind him the memory of a just prince adored by his subjects. Should we not search in vain through the annals of any other country in the world for facts analogous to these? Must it not be regretted that the Spaniards should have brought war with all its attendant horrors, and the maladies and vices of a different climate, along with what they in their pride called civilization, amongst a rich and happy people, whose descendants, impoverished and debased as they are, have not even the recollection of their ancient prosperity to console them in their irremediable decay? The Peruvians, says Michelet in his admirable Preces de Historia Moderne, handed down the principal facts to prosperity by knots, which they made in ropes. They had obelisks and exact gromens to mark the equinoxes and solstices. Their year consisted of 365 days. They had erected prodigies of agriculture, and they carved statues with amazing art. They formed the most polished and industrious nation of the world. The Inca Huayna Capac, father of Atahualpa, under whom this vast empire was destroyed, had done much to increase and embellish it. This Inca, who conquered all the country of Quito, had made, by the hands of his soldiers and of the vanquished people, a great road, 1,500 miles in length from Cusco to Quito, across precipices which had to be filled up and mountains which had to be leveled. Relays of men, stationed at intervals of a mile and a half from each other, carried the emperor's orders throughout the empire. Such was their police, and if we wish to judge a Peruvian magnificence, we need only instance the fact that the king, when he traveled, was carried on a throne of gold which weighed 25,000 ducats, and the gold litter upon which the throne rested was borne by the highest personages of the realm. End of second part, chapter 1, part 2c. Recording by hearhis.com.
Section 29 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tech Savvy. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 1. Part 3b. In 1526, when the Spaniards appeared on the coast for the first time, the 12th Inca had lately married, in defiance of the ancient law of the kingdom, the daughter of the vanquished king of Quito, and had had a son of this marriage named Atahualpa, to whom he left this kingdom on his death, which happened about 1529. His eldest son, Huascar, whose mother was descended from the Incas, had the remainder of his states. But this partition, so contrary to the customs established from time immemorial, caused such great discontent at Cuzco, that Huascar, encouraged by his subjects, determined to march against his brother, who would not acknowledge him for his lord and master. Atahualpa, in his turn, had too lately tasted power to be willing to abandon it. He managed by bribes to attach to himself the greater part of the warriors who had accompanied his father during the conquest of Quito, and when the two armies met, fortune favored the usurper. Is it not curious to remark how both in Peru and Mexico the Spaniards were aided by entirely exceptional circumstances? In Mexico some of the people who had recently submitted to the Aztec race, being mercilessly trampled upon by their conquerors, welcomed the Spaniards as deliverers. In Peru the strife between the two brothers, furious against each other, hinders the Indians from turning all their forces against the invaders, whom they might easily have crushed. Pizarro, upon receiving the envoy sent by Huascar to ask his aid against his brother Atahualpa, whom he represented as a rebel and usurper, saw at once all the advantages that might accrue to him from these circumstances. He saw that by espousing the cause of one of the brothers, he could more easily crush them both. Therefore he advanced at once into the interior of the country at the head of a very inconsiderable force, consisting of 62 cavalry and 120 foot soldiers, of whom only 20 were armed with arquebuses and muskets. He was obliged to leave part of his troops to guard San Miguel, in which Pizarro reckoned upon finding a refuge in case of being unsuccessful, and where in any case all supplies which might arrive could be landed. Pizarro made first for Caxamalca, a small town situated at about 20 days' march from the coast. To reach it he had to cross a desert of burning sand, without vegetation and without water, which extended for 60 miles in length as far as the province of Matupi, and where the slightest attack of the enemy, joined to the sufferings endured by the little army, would have been sufficient to crush the whole expedition at one blow. Next the troops plunged into the mountains and became entangled in narrow defiles where a small force might have annihilated them. During this march Pizarro received an envoy from Atahualpa, bringing him some painted shoes and gold bracelets, which he was requested to wear at his approaching interview with the Inca. Naturally Pizarro was lavish in his promises of friendship and devotion, and assured the Indian ambassador that he should be only following the orders given him by the king, his master, in respecting the lives and the property of the inhabitants. From the moment of this arrival at Caxamalca, Pizarro prudently lodged his soldiers in a temple and palace belonging to the Inca, where they were sheltered from any surprise. Then he sent one of his brothers with De Soto and 20 horse soldiers to the camp of Atahualpa, which was distant only 3 miles, to announce to him his arrival. The envoys of the governor were received with magnificence, and were astonished at the multiplicity of the ornaments and vases made of gold and silver which they saw throughout the Indian camp. They returned, bringing a promise from Atahualpa that he would come on the next day to visit Pizarro, to bid him welcome to his kingdom. At the same time the envoys gave an account of the wonderful riches they had seen, which confirmed Pizarro in the project which he had formed of seizing the unfortunate Atahualpa and his treasures by treachery. Several Spanish authors, and notably Zarate, disguised these facts, which no doubt appeared to them too odious, and altogether denied the treachery towards Atahualpa. But at the present day there are extant many documents which force the historians to believe, with Robertson and Prescott, in the perfidy of Pizarro. It was very important for him to have the Inca in his own hands, and to employ him as a tool, just as Cortes had done with Montezuma. He therefore took advantage of the honesty and simplicity of Atahualpa, who placed entire confidence in Pizarro's protestations of friendship, and so was thrown off his guard, to arrange an ambuscade into which Atahualpa was certain to fall. There was not a scruple in the disloyal soul of the conqueror. He was as cool as though he were about to offer battle to enemies who had been forewarned of his approach. This infamous treason must be an eternal dishonor to his memory. Pizarro divided his cavalry into 3 small squadrons, left all his infantry in one body and his arquebusiers on the road in which the Inca must pass, and kept 20 of his most determined companions near himself. Atahualpa, wishing to give the Spaniards a great idea of his power, advanced the whole of his army. He himself was borne upon a kind of bed decorated with feathers, covered with plates of gold and silver, and ornamented with precious stones. He was accompanied by his principal nobles, carried like himself on the shoulders of their servants, and he was surrounded by dancers and jesters. Such a march was more that of a procession than of an army. As soon as the Inca had nearly reached the Spanish quarters, Father Vincent Valverde, the chaplain of the expedition, who was afterwards made a bishop as a reward for his conduct, advanced with the crucifix in one hand and his breviary in the other. In an interminable discourse he set forth to the monarch the doctrine of the creation, the fall of the first man, the incarnation, passion, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the choice made by God of St. Peter to be his vicar upon earth, the power transmitted through him to the popes, and the gift made by Pope Alexander to the King of Castile of all regions of the New World. When he had expounded all these doctrines, he called upon Atahualpa to embrace the Christian religion, to recognize the supreme authority of the Pope, and to submit to the King of Castile as his legitimate sovereign. If he submitted immediately, Valverde undertook to promise that the king his master would take Peru under his protection, and allow him to continue to reign there. But he declared war against him and threatened him with fearful vengeance if he refused to obey and persevered in his impiety. To say the least of it, this was a singular scene and a very strange harangue, alluding to facts which were utterly unknown to the Peruvians, and of the truth of which a more skilful orator than Valverde would not have succeeded in persuading them. If we add that the interpreter knew so little of the Spanish language that it was almost an impossibility for him to translate what he scarcely understood himself, and that the Peruvian language lacked words to express ideas so foreign to its genius, we shall not be much surprised to learn that Atahualpa understood almost nothing of the Spanish monk's discourse. Some sentences, however, which attacked his own power, filled him with surprise and indignation, but he was none the less moderate in his reply. He said that a master of his own kingdom by right of succession, he could not see how any one had the power to dispose of it without his consent. He added that he was not at all willing to renounce the religion of his fathers to adopt one of which he had only heard that day for the first time. With regard to the other points touched upon in the discourse he understood nothing. It was a thing entirely new to him, and he would much like to know where Valverde had learned so many wonderful things. In this book, replied Valverde, handing him his breviary. Atahualpa received it with eagerness, and turned over some of the leaves with much more curiosity. Then, putting it to his ear, he exclaimed, "What you show me there does not speak to me and tells me nothing." With this he flung the book upon the ground. This served as a signal for the combat, or rather for the massacre. Cannon and muskets came into play, the cavalry sprang forward, and the infantry fell sword in hand upon the stupefied Peruvians. In a few moments the confusion was at its height. The Indians fled on all sides without attempting to defend themselves. As to Atahualpa, although his principal officers tried to make a rampart of their own bodies while they carried him off, Pizarro sprang upon him, dispersed or overthrew his guards, and seizing him by his long hair threw him down from the litter in which he was carried. Only the darkness could arrest the carnage. 4,000 Indians were killed, a great number wounded, and 3,000 taken prisoners. An incontestable proof that there was no real battle is that of all the Spaniards Pizarro alone was hit, and he received his wound from one of his own soldiers who was too precipitately endeavoring to seize upon the Inca. The booty collected in the camp and from the dead exceeded anything the Spaniards could have imagined, and their enthusiasm was proportioned to the conquest of such riches. At first Atahualpa bore his captivity with resignation, which may have been partly due to Pizarro's doing all he could see to soothe him, at least by words. But the Inca, soon understanding the unbridled covetousness of his jailers, made a proposal to Pizarro to pay him ransom. and to have a room of 22 feet in length by 16 in width filled as high as the hand could reach with vases, utensils, and ornaments of gold. Pizarro eagerly agreed to this, and the captive Inca dispatched the necessary orders to all the provinces. These were carried out promptly and unmurmuringly. Beyond this the Indian troops were disbanded, and Pizarro was able to send Soto and 5 Spaniards to Cuzco, a town situated more than 600 miles from Caxamalca, while he himself subjugated all the country within a circuit of 300 miles. In the meantime Almagro landed with 200 soldiers. There had been set aside for him and his men, with what regrets may easily be imagined, 100,000 pesos, a Spanish coin. A fifth was reserved for the king, and this left 1,528,500 pesos to be divided between the Pizarro and his companions. This product of pillage and massacre was solemnly divided between those entitled to it on the festival of St. James, the patron saint of Spain, after fervent prayer to God. A deplorable mixture this of religion and profanity, too common unfortunately in these times of mingled superstition and avarice. Each horse soldier received 8,000 pesos as his share, and each foot soldier 4,000, which would be equivalent to about 1,600 and 800 sterling. This was enough to satisfy the most exacting soldier after a campaign which had been neither long nor difficult. Many of the adventurers wished to enjoy this unexpected good fortune in a peaceable manner in their own country, and eagerly asked for their dismissal. The Pizarro granted without hesitation, for he felt sure that the news of their rapidly acquired wealth would soon bring him new recruits. With his brother Ferdinand, who went to Spain to give the emperor an account of Pizarro's triumph, and some splendid presents, went 60 Spaniards, laden heavy indeed with money, but lightly with remorse. As soon as Atahualpa's ransom was paid, he claimed his freedom, but Pizarro, who had only saved his life, that he might make all the treasures of Peru his own and shelter himself under the prestige and authority which the Inca still exercised over his subjects, was soon wearied by his entreaties. He suspected him also of having for some time secretly given orders to levy troops in the distant provinces of the empire. Besides, Atahualpa, having soon discovered that Pizarro was no better educated than one of the lowest of his soldiers, felt in consequence a contempt for the governor which unfortunately he could not conceal. Such were the reasons, all trivial as they were, which determined Pizarro to prepare for the trial of the Inca. Nothing could have been more hateful than his trial, in which Almagro and Pizarro were at the same time both suitors and judges. The heads and the accusation were so ridiculous and absurd that one is in doubt whether to be most surprised by the effrontery of the wickedness of Pizarro in subjecting the head of a powerful empire over which he had no jurisdiction to such an inquiry. Atahualpa, being found guilty, was condemned to be burnt alive, but as he had at length asked to be baptized, that he might rid himself of the importunities of Valverde, his enemies content himself with strangling him. A worthy counterpart this of Guatimozin's execution. These were amongst the most atrocious and odious deeds committed by the Spaniards in America, which, however, they were sullied themselves with every imaginable crime. Among this herd of adventurers there were still some men who had retained sentiments of honor and self-respect. They protested loudly against this perversion of justice, but their generous mispleadings were stifled by the selfish declamations of Pizarro and his worthy assistants. The governor now raised one of Atahualpa's sons to the throne under the name of Paul Inca, but the civil war between the two brothers, and the events which had occurred since the arrival of the Spaniards, had done much to loosen the ties which bound the Peruvians to their kings, and this young man, destined soon to die in an ignominious death, had scarcely more authority than Manco Capac, the son of Huasca, who was acknowledged by the inhabitants of Cuzco. Soon after this, some of the principal people in the country even tried to carve for themselves kingdoms out of the empire of Peru. Such was Remenegui, the commandant of Quito, who caused the brother and the children of Atahualpa to be massacred, and declared himself independent. Discord reigned in the Peruvian camp, and the Spaniards resolved to take advantage of it. Pizarro advanced rapidly upon Cuzco, the small number of his forces having been the only reason which had prevented him from doing so sooner. Now that a crowd of adventurers, attracted by the treasures which had been brought back to Panama, vied with each other in hastening to Peru, now that he could assemble 500 men. After leaving an important garrison at San Miguel under Benalcazar's command, Pizarro had no further reason for delay. On the way some skirmishes took place with large bodies of troops, but they ended as always with severe losses to natives, and a very insignificant one to the Spaniards. When they entered Cuzco and took possession of the town, the invaders showed surprise at the small quantity of gold and precious stones which they found there, although it far exceeded Atahualpa's ransom. Was this because they were becoming accustomed to the riches of the country, or because there was a larger number to share in them? Meanwhile, Benalcazar, being weary of inaction, took advantage of the arrival of reinforcements from Nicaragua and Panama to set out for Quito, where, according to the Peruvians, Atahualpa had left the greater part of his treasure. He placed himself at the head of 80 horse soldiers and 120 infantry, defeated on several occasions Rummenigge, who disputed his passage, and thanks to his prudence and cleverness, he entered Quito victorious, but did not find there what he sought, this is to say, the treasures of Atahualpa. At the same time, Pedro de Alvarado, who had so signally distinguished himself under Cortes, and who had been made governor of Guatemala, as a reward for his services, pretended to believe the provinces of Quito was not included in Pizarro's command, and organized an expedition consisting of 500 men, 200 of whom were cavalry. Landing at Porto Viejo, he wished to reach Quito without a guide, by going up the Guayaquil River and crossing the Andes. This road has always been one of the worst and the most trying that it is possible to choose. Before they had reached the plain of Quito, after horrible sufferings from hunger and thirst, without speaking of the burning cinders hurled from the crater of Chimborazo, a volcano near Quito, and the snowstorms which assailed them, the fifth part of the band of adventurers and half the horses had perished. The remainder were completely discouraged and quite unfit for fighting. It was therefore with the greatest surprise and some uneasiness that they found themselves face to face, not with a body of Indians as they had expected, but with a party of Spaniards under the command of Almagro. The latter were preparing to charge, when some of the more moderate among the officers caused an arrangement to be entered into by virtue of which Alvarado was to withdraw to his own province after receiving 100,000 pesos to defray the expenses of the armament. Ferdinand Pizarro had set sail for Spain while these events were happening in Peru, feeling sure that the immense quantity of gold, silver, and precious stones which he took with him would secure him a warm welcome. He obtained for his brother Francisco the confirmation of his appointment as governor. With more extended powers, he himself was made a knight of the order of St. Iago. As for Almagro, he was confirmed in his title of adelantado, and his jurisdiction was extended 600 miles, without, however, its limits being very strictly defined, which left the door open for many contests and all kinds of arbitrary interpretations. Ferdinand Pizarro had not reached Peru again when Almagro, having learned that a special government had been assigned to him, pretended that Cuzco formed part of it, and made preparations for its conquest. But Juan and Gonzalo Pizarro had no intention of allowing themselves to be robbed, and the parties were on the point of coming to blows when Francisco Pizarro, who is often called Marquis or the Great Marquis, arrived at the capital. Almagro had never forgiven Francisco Pizarro the duplicity which he had displayed in his negotiation with Charles V, nor the coolness with which he had claimed for himself, at the expense of his two friends, the principal share of authority and the most extended government. But as Almagro met with great oppositions to his designs, and as he was not the stronger, he concealed his vexation, put a good face on the matter, and seemed delighted at reconciliation. They renewed their partnership, therefore, says Zarate, on condition that Don Diego de Almagro should go and discover the country on the south side, and
If he found it any that was really good, they should ask his Majesty to make the governor of it, but that if he found nothing to suit him, they should share Don Francisco's government between them. This arrangement was made very solemnly, and they took their oath upon the consecrated wafer, and for the future they would undertake nothing against one another. Some say that Almagro swore that he would never encroach either upon Cuzco or on the surrounding country within 390 miles, even if his Majesty should give him the government of it. They add that turning towards the holy sacrament he pronounced these words: "Lord, if I violate the oath that I now take, I pray that thou wilt confound me and punish me both in my body and my soul." After this solemn agreement, which was destined to be observed with a little fidelity at the first, Almagro made his preparations for departure. Thanks to his well-known liberality, as much as to his reputation for courage, he gathered together 570 men, of being equal numbers of cavalry and infantry, which he set out by land for Chili. The journey was an extremely trying one, and the adventurers suffered severely from the intense cold while crossing the Andes. They had also to deal with the very warlike tribes, unsoftened by any civilization, who assailed them with a fury of which nothing they had seen in Peru had given them any idea. Almagro could no longer make any settlement, for he had scarcely been 2 months in the country, where he heard that the Indians in Peru had revolted and massacred the greater part of the Spaniards, whereupon he immediately retraced his steps. After the new partnerships had been assigned between the conquerors, Pizarro had returned to the provinces bordering on the sea, in which he could establish a regular government, there being no longer anything to dread from resistance. For a man who had never studied legislation, he had drawn up some very wise rules for administration of justice, for the collection of taxes, the apportionment of Indians, and the working of the mines. Some parts of the conquistador's character were doubtless very open to criticism, but it is only just to recognize that he was not wanting in enlarged ideas, but he was conscientious in playing his part as the founder of the great empire. This it was which made him hesitate long before choosing the future capital of Spanish possessions. Cuzco had the recommendation of having been the residence of the Incas, but this town, situated more than 400 miles from the sea, was very distant from Quito, of which the importance seemed to Pizarro to be extreme. Before long he was struck with the beauty and fertility of the great valley, watered by a stream called the Rimac. There in 1536 he established the seat of his dominion. Soon the City of Kings, or Lima, as it is called by a corruption of the name of the river which flows at its feet, assumed the aspect of a great city, owing to the magnificent palace and the sumptuous residence for officers, which Pizarro caused to be built there. While these cares kept Pizarro far from his capital, small bodies of troops, sent in different directions, penetrated into the most distant provinces of the empire, with the object of extinguishing the last smouldering embers of resistance. So many of the soldiers were employed in this way, that there remained in Cuzco itself but a very small body of troops. The Inca, who had remained in the hands of the Spaniards, thought this an opportune moment for fomenting a general rising, in which he earnestly hoped that the foreign government might be overthrown. Although closely guarded, he contrived to take his measures with so much skill that he did not arouse the suspicions of his oppressors. He obtained permission even to be present at a grand fete, which was to be held at several miles' distance from Cuzco, and for which the most distinguished persons in the empire had met together. As soon as the Inca appeared, the standard of the revolt was raised. The country was soon in arms from the confines of the province of Quito as far as Chile, and a number of small detachments of Spaniards were surprised and destroyed. Cuzco, defended by the three brothers Pizarro, but about 170 Spaniards, were exposed for 8 consecutive months to the incessant attacks of the Peruvians, who had now become an expert in the use of arms which they had taken from their enemies. The conquerors made a most valiant resistance, but experienced some severe losses, especially that of Juan Pizarro. Almagro left Chile in the greatest haste, crossed the stony and the sandy desert of Atacama, where he suffered as severely from heat and drought as he had done in the Andes from cold and snow, penetrated into the Peruvian territory, defeated Manco Capac in a great battle, and succeeded in approaching the town of Cuzco, after having driven away the Indians. He then tried to get the town given up to him, on the pretext that it was not included in Pizarro's government, and violating a truce during which the followers of the marquis were taking a short rest, he entered Cuzco, seized both Ferdinand and Gonzalo Pizarro, and had acknowledged himself as a governor. End of second part, chapter 3, part 1a. Recording by TechSavvy, www.techsavvy.wordpress.com.
Section 30 of Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Celebrated Travels and Travelers, Volume 1. Exploration of the World by Jules Verne. Second part, Chapter 1, Part 3c. While this was going on, a considerable body of Indians invested Lima, intercepted all communications, and annihilated the various small bodies of troops which Pizarro sent at intervals to the aid of the Spaniards at Cuzco. At this time he sent away all his vessels to Panama to compel his companions to make a desperate resistance. He recalled from Truxillo the forces under the command of Alonso de Alvarado, and entrusted to the latter a column of 500 men, which advanced to within several miles of the capital without having the slightest suspicion that the town was now in the hands of fellow countrymen, who were fully determined to bar their passage. But Almagro desired much rather to attract these new adversaries to himself than to destroy them. He arranged therefore to surprise them and make them prisoners. He had now a fine opportunity in his hands of ending the war, and making himself master of the two governments by a single blow. Several of his officers had observed this to him, and especially Orgoños, who proposed that the two brothers of the Conquistador should be put to death, and that Almagro should advance by forced marches with his victorious troops against Lima, or Pizarro, taken by surprise, would not be able to resist him. But as a Latin poet says, Jupiter makes dotards of those whom he means to ruin. Almagro, who in so many other instances had thrown aside all scruples, did not wish to put himself in the wrong by invading Pizarro's dominions as a rebel, and he quietly took the road back to Cuzco. Looking at it only from the side of Almagro's own interests, he evidently committed in this a gross blunder, of which he was soon to repent. But if we consider what we should never lose sight of, the interest of the country, he had already committed a capital crime in the acts of aggression of which he had been guilty, and in kindling civil war in face of an enemy quite ready to take advantage of it. His adversaries did not delay to remind him of it, whereas prompt decision would have been necessary for Almagro to make him master of the situation. Pizarro had everything to expect from time and opportunity. While waiting for the promised reinforcements from Darien, he commenced negotiations with his adversary, lasting for several months, during which time one of his brothers, as well as Alvarado, found means to escape with more than 70 men. Although Almagro had been so often duped, he consented again to receive the licentiate Espinosa, who was ordered to represent to him that if the emperor knew what was taking place between the two competitors, and learned the condition to which their contest had reduced affairs, no doubt he would recall them both, and put someone else in their place. At last, after the death of Espinosa, it was decided by the friar Francisco de Bobadilla, to whom Pizarro and Almagro had referred their differences, that Ferdinand Pizarro should be immediately set free, that Cuzco should be given back to the Marquis, and that they should send several officers on both sides to Spain, charged with representing the respective rights of the two parties and submitting them to the Emperor's decision. Scarcely had the last of his brothers been set at liberty than Pizarro, rejecting all idea of peace and amicable arrangement, declared that arms alone should decide whether he or Almagro was to be lord of Peru. In a short time he had assembled a body of 700 men, of which he entrusted the command to his two brothers. Finding it impossible to cross the mountains which would have been the most direct road to Cuzco, they followed the line of the sea-coast as far as Nazca, and then penetrated into a branch of the Andes, by which they could reach the capital in a short time. Possibly Almagro ought to have defended the mountain defiles, but he had only 500 men, and he reckoned much on his splendid cavalry, whom he could not deploy in a confined space. He therefore waited for the enemy in the plain of Cuzco. The two parties encountered each other on the 26th of April, 1538, with equal animosity, but the victory was decided by 2 companies of musketeers, which the Emperor had sent to Pizarro when he heard of the revolt of the Indians. 140 soldiers perished in this engagement, which received the name of Las Salinas. Orgoños and several officers of distinction were killed in cold blood after the battle, and Almagro himself, aged and ill, could not escape from Pizarro. The Indians who, assembled in arms on the surrounding mountains, had reckoned upon falling on the conqueror, had need instead to fly in all haste. Nothing, says Robertson, more entirely proves the ascendancy gained by the Spaniards over the Americans, than seeing that the latter, witnesses of the defeat and dispersion of one of the parties, had not the courage to attack the other, even weakened and fatigued as they were by their victory, and dared not fall upon their oppressors when fortune offered them so favourable an opportunity for attacking them with advantage. At this period a victory not followed by pillage was incomplete, so the town of Cuzco was sacked, and all the riches that Pizarro's companions found there did not suffice to content them. They had such exalted ideas of their merits and of the services which they had rendered, that each would have desired an appointment as governor. Ferdinand Pizarro therefore dispersed them, and sent them to conquer fresh territories, with some of the partisans of Almagro, who had rallied, and whom it was important to send to a distance. As for Almagro himself, Ferdinand Pizarro, feeling convinced that his name constituted a focus of permanent agitation, resolved to get rid of him. He caused him therefore to be put upon his trial, which ended, as it was easy to foresee, in a sentence of death. When Almagro received this news, after giving way for a few moments of a very natural grief, pleading his great age and the different way in which he had behaved with regard to Ferdinand and Gonzalo Pizarro when they were his prisoners, he recovered his calmness and awaited his death with a soldier's courage. He was strangled in his prison, and afterwards publicly beheaded. 1538. After several successful expeditions, Ferdinand Pizarro set out for Spain to give the Emperor an account of what had taken place. He found most minds there strangely prejudiced against him and his brothers. Their cruelty, their violence, and their disregard for the most sacred engagements had been laid bare without reserve by some friends of Almagro's. Ferdinand Pizarro needed the utmost cleverness to win the Emperor round. Charles V had no means of judging fairly on which side the justice of the case lay, for he had only heard of it from the interested parties. He could only discern the deplorable consequences to his own government of the Civil War. He decided therefore to send a commissioner to the country, to whom he gave most extensive powers, and who, after having inquired into all that had taken place, should establish whatever form of government he thought most advisable. This delicate mission was confided to Cristobal de Vaca, a judge of audience at Valladolid, who proved not unequal to his task. One fact is worthy of notice. He was recommended to show the greatest respect toward Francisco Pizarro, at the very time when his brother Ferdinand was arrested and thrown into a prison, where he was destined to remain forgotten for 20 years. While these events were taking place in Spain, the Marquis portioned out the conquered country, keeping for himself and his trustworthy friends the most fertile and best situated districts, and giving to Almagro's companions, the men of Chile, as they were called, only the more sterile and distant territories. Next he confided to Pedro de Valdivia, one of his aides de camp, the execution of the project which Almagro had only been able to sketch out, the conquest of Chile. Valdivia set out on the 28th of January, 1540, with 150 Spaniards, amongst whom Pedro Gomez, Pedro de Miranda, and Alonso de Monroy were destined especially to distinguish themselves. He crossed first the desert of Atacama, which even at the present day is considered a most troublesome enterprise, and reached Copiapo, standing in the midst of a beautiful valley. Received at first with great cordiality, he had to sustain, as soon as harvest was over, several combats with the Araucanians, a race of brave, indefatigable warriors, very different from the Indians of Peru. In spite of this, he laid the foundations of the town of Santiago on the 12th of February, 1541. Valdivia spent 8 years in Chile, presiding over the conquest and organization of the country. Less greedy than the other conquistadores his contemporaries, he only sought for the mineral riches of the country that he might ensure the development of the prosperity of his colony, in which he had taken care first of all to encourage agriculture. The best mine that I know of is one of corn and wine with nourishment for livestock. Who has this has money. As for mines, we do not depend upon them for subsistence, and often that which looks well outwardly is not really worth much. These wise words of Lescarbot, in his Histoire de la Nouvelle France, might have been used by Valdivia, so exactly do they correspond with and express his sentiments. His valour, prudence, and humanity, more especially the latter quality, which shines forth strangely in contrast with the cruelty of Pizarro, ensures for him a distinction all of his own among the conquistadores of the 16th century. At the time that Valdivia set out for Chile, Gonzalo Pizarro crossed the Andes at the head of 340 Spaniards, half of whom were mounted, and 4,000 Indians, of whom the greater part of the Indians perished from cold. Then he penetrated eastwards into the interior, seeking for a country where spices and cinnamon was said to abound. In these vast savannas, intersected by marshes and virgin forests, the Spaniards encountered torrents of rain, which lasted quite 2 months. They found only a scattered population who were not industrious and also hostile. In consequence, the invaders often suffered from hunger in a country where there were then neither horses nor oxen, where the largest quadrupeds were tapirs and llamas, and even the latter was seldom met with on this slope of the Andes. In spite of these difficulties, which would have discouraged any less energetic explorers than the descubridores of the 16th century, they persevered in their attempt and descended the Rio Napo or Coca, an affluent on the left of the Marañon, as far as its confluence. There, with great difficulty, they built a brigantine, which was manned by 50 soldiers under the command of Francisco Orellana. But either the strength of the current carried him away, or else being no longer under the eyes of his chief, he wished in his turn to be the leader of an expedition of discovery. He did not wait for Gonzalo Pizarro at the appointed rendezvous, but continued to descend the river until he reached the ocean. Such a voyage is simply marvellous. Through nearly 6,000 miles of an unknown region, without guide, without compass, without provisions, with a crew who murmured more than once against the foolish attempt of their leader, and in the midst of populations almost invariably hostile. From the mouth of the river, which he had just descended in his badly built and dilapidated vessel, Orellana succeeded in reaching the island of Cubagua, whence he set sail for Spain. If the proverb, "He who comes from a distance tells many lies," were not of much earlier date, one might have thought it had been coined for Orellana. He invented the most preposterous fables as to the wealth of the countries he had traversed. The inhabitants were so rich that the roofs of the temples were formed with plates of gold, an assertion which gave rise to the legend of El Dorado. Orellana had heard of the existence of a republic of female warriors who had founded a vast empire, which caused the river Marañon to be called the River of the Amazons. If, however, we strip this narrative of all that is ridiculous and grotesque, and calculated to please the imaginations of his contemporaries, it remains certain that Orellana's expedition is one of the most remarkable of this epoch, so fertile in gigantic enterprises, and it furnishes the first information upon the immense zone of country lying between the Andes and the Atlantic. But we must return to Gonzalo Pizarro. His embarrassment and consternation had been great when on arriving at the confluence of the Napo and the Marañon he had not found Orellana, who was to have been awaiting him. Fearing that some accident might have befallen his lieutenant, he had descended the course of the river for 150 miles, until he met with an unfortunate officer who had been left behind for having addressed some remonstrances to his chief upon his perfidy. The bravest among Pizarro's men were discouraged at the news of the cowardly way in which they had been abandoned, and at the destitute condition in which they were left. Pizarro was obliged to yield to their entreaties, and to return to Quito, from which they were more than 1,200 miles away. To give an idea of their sufferings on this return journey, it suffices to say that after having eaten horses, dogs, and reptiles, roots and wild beasts, and after having devoured every article made of leather in their accoutrements, the unfortunate survivors who reached Quito, lacerated by brambles, emaciated and utterly impoverished, numbered only 24. 4,000 Indians and 210 Spaniards had perished in this expedition, which had lasted less than 2 years. While Gonzalo Pizarro was conducting the fortunate expedition just related, the old partisans of Almagro, who had never frankly joined Pizarro, gathered round the son of their old leader, and formed a plot for murdering the Marquis. In vain was Francisco Pizarro several times warned of what was threatening him. He would pay no heed to the report. He said, "Keep quiet. I shall be safe as long as there is no one in Peru who does not know that I can in a moment take the life of anyone who should dare to form the project of attempting mine." On Sunday the 26th of June 1541, at the hour of siesta, Juan de Herrada and 18 conspirators left the house of Almagro's son with drawn swords in their hands and armed from top to toe. They ran towards the house of Pizarro, crying out, "Death to the tyrant! Death to the infamous wretch!" They entered the palace, killed Francisco de Chaves, who had appeared in haste on hearing the noise, and gained the hall, where was Francisco Pizarro with his brother Francisco Martin, the doctor Juan Velasquez, and a dozen servants. These jumped out of the windows, with the exception of Martin Pizarro, 2 other gentlemen, and 2 tall pages, who were killed while defending the door of the governor's apartment. He himself had not had time to put on his cuirass, but he seized his sword and buckler and defended himself valiantly, killing 4 of his adversaries and wounding several others. One of his assailants, in the spirit of self-devotion, attracted to himself the blows of Pizarro. Meanwhile the other conspirators made their way in and attacked him with such fury that he could not parry all the blows, being so exhausted that he could scarcely wield his sword. "Thus," says Zarate, "they made an end and succeeded in killing him by a thrust in the throat." Falling to the ground, he asked in a loud voice that he might be allowed to confess, and then not being able any longer to speak, he made the sign of the cross on the ground, which he kissed, and then yielded up his soul to God. Some negroes carried his body to the church, where Juan Barbazan, his old servant, alone ventured to come and claim it. This faithful servant secretly rendered to it funeral honours, for the conspirators had pillaged the house of Pizarro, not leaving enough even to pay for wax tapers. Thus did Francisco Pizarro come to his end, assassinated even in the capital of the vast empire which Spain owed to his valour and indefatigable perseverance, but which he bestowed upon his country, it must be admitted, ravaged, decimated, and drowned in a deluge of blood. Pizarro is often compared with Cortes. The one had as much ambition, courage, and military capacity as the other, but the cruelty and avarice of the Marquis de la Valle were carried to an extreme in Pizarro, and united in him to perfidy and duplicity. If we are inclined to excuse certain parts of Cortes's character which are not estimable by the times in which he lived, we are at least charmed by that grace and ability of manners, and by that way of a gentleman above prejudices, which made him so much beloved by the soldier. In Pizarro, on the contrary, we find roughness, and a harsh unsympathizing way of feeling, while his chivalrous qualities disappear entirely behind the rapacity and perfidy which are the salient features of his character. If Cortés found brave and resolute adversaries among the Mexicans who opposed almost insurmountable difficulties to his progress, Pizarro had no trouble in vanquishing the Peruvians, who were timid and enervated, and who never made any serious resistance to his arms. Of the conquests of Peru and Mexico, the less difficult produced the greater metallurgic advantage to Spain, and thus it was more appreciated. The civil war was on the point of breaking out again after Pizarro's death, when the governor arrived, who was delegated by the metropolitan government. As soon as he had collected the needful troops, he marched towards Cuzco. He seized young Almagro without trouble, had him beheaded with 40 of his confederates, and governed the country with firmness until the viceroy Blasco Núñez Vela arrived. It is not our intention to enter into the detail of the disputes which took place between the latter and Gonzalo Pizarro, who, profiting by the general discontent caused by the new regulations as to the repartimientos, revolted against the emperor's representative. After many changes of fortune, for which we have not space, the struggle ended by the defeat and execution of Gonzalo Pizarro, which took place in 1548. His body was taken to Cuzco and buried fully dressed. No one, said Garcilaso de la Vega, being willing to give even a winding sheet for it. Thus ended the judicial assassin of Almagro. Is not the text appropriate in this case? They that take the sword shall perish with the sword. End of second part, chapter 1, part 3c.